The story of early Islam is a story of the pursuit of knowledge. There were power struggles and bitter divisions. But Islam was united in its respect for learning, giving the world art, invention, and Cairo, one of mankind's oldest living cities. Throughout the Muslim world, I have seen how the great builders of Islam used materials from earlier civilizations, adapting them for their own purposes. In the same way, traditions from different faiths played their part in building Islam. In Egypt, two great dynasties, the Fatimids and the Mamluks, ruled for centuries. And two great Muslim traditions, Shia and Sunni, struggled for supremacy. I am a Sunni Muslim, but I can easily appreciate the great contribution both traditions have made to my religion. In the centuries which followed the Arab conquest of Egypt, there were the peaks and troughs which go with the establishment of any great civilization. For me, the peaks were all associated with the greatest respect for art, knowledge, and learning. In Arabic, they call it ilm. The first of Egypt's dominating dynasties were the Fatimids, Shia Muslims who swept in from North Africa in the year 969. They established their capital on the banks of the Nile. I am standing at one of the main gates, one of the main entrances to the city of Cairo, both built 1,000 years ago by the Fatimid dynasty. The Fatimids were great patrons of art and architecture, and here they saw off the pilgrims to Mecca with song and pomp and ceremony. The Fatimids claimed identity and descent from Fatima, the daughter of the Prophet of Islam, and their name underlined their Shia status. The Fatimids not only built, they inherited. Their new city had one architectural treasure they would have been hard put to recognize at first. When they arrived, this building was neglected and decaying. Today, it is regarded as a masterpiece. I'm here at the Ibn Mosque in Cairo, one of the oldest and largest in the entire Muslim world. A mosque is primarily a house of worship, a house of God. But students come here to seek knowledge and learning, travelers to find hospitality, and sometimes those on the run to find sanctuary. The students are still here, although nowadays tourists have replaced the travelers. There's plenty for these students to draw. Each arcade around the central courtyard stretches out for about 100 meters. Ibn Tulun himself was a Turkish general who had become governor of Cairo in the middle of the 9th century. At that time, the Muslim world was ruled from Iraq. The ruling dynasty built themselves a capital in Iraq at Samarra. Ibn Tulun declared himself independent, and Egypt became his personal fiefdom. Some say he was fiery and erratic, but even so, he loved art and building. His memory is preserved by his marvelous mosque.
Ibn Tulun is the largest, most significant piece of surviving architecture from the 9th century in Egypt. It's an enormous mosque which was built on a courtyard plan imported from Samarra. Ibn Tulun came from Samarra and he built in the style to which he was accustomed.
Ibn Tulun built with brick to resist fire and on a hill to avoid flood. The story goes that this was the hill on which Noah's Ark landed and that bits of the ark were used in the roofing structure. Building a mosque was an expensive business and ate up money. Ibn Tulun built his mosque with the taxes his people thought he was forwarding to the Caliphate in Samarra. He thought it prudent to disguise what he was doing, so he told his people that he had found ancient Egyptian buried treasure. The money wasn't wasted. It is a mosque of exquisite subtlety. Every one of the 128 carved windows has a different design. The windows above the mihrab or prayer niche nearly mirror the squinches either side of them. Squinches are the corner devices which join the square of the earthly mosque to the circle of the heavenly dome. The mosque was built with this one original mihrab or prayer niche. This indicates the direction of prayer, but it was hardly enough for the vast numbers of worshippers. So over time, another 4 made of carved plasterwork were added.
The other aspect of the mosque that's obviously of great significance is the minaret. It is the only minaret in Egypt that has a staircase on the outside of its main structure, and it follows a spiral pattern. And again, there's a very lovely story about how Ibn Tulun was sitting with his architect discussing the shape of the minaret and what sort of minaret it should be. And at that time he was playing with a piece of paper wrapped around his finger, parchment, and he tried to extricate the paper off his finger and it pulled away in the form of a spiral. So at that point he said to his architect, that's how the minaret should be.
And that's roughly how the minaret was, based on the model of minarets in Samarra. The Tulunid dynasty didn't last long and the mosque nearly didn't either. This glorious minaret decayed. Nearly 4 centuries later, by then the gilded dome had fallen off the fountain, rescue was at hand. It came from a fugitive emir accused of conspiracy.
There's a story from the 13th century about a Mamluk prince who hid here. He promised God that if he survived, one of the first things he would do is restore the mosque to its ancient glory. He survived and he kept his promise. When he became ruler, the first thing he did was order the restoration of the Ibn Tulun mosque to its former glory.
The Fatimid caliphs ruled from North Africa to Syria. In Egypt, they had inherited the existing capital of Fustat. The old city of Cairo, though, was their creation, although succeeding dynasties have stamped their imprint. At the heart of the city were 2 great palaces, long since destroyed. The street called Bain al-Khasrain is today the fulcrum of the old city, as it was 1,000 years ago.
Nicholas, we're on the street between the 2 palaces. What is its historical significance?
Well, it was always the spine of the historic city from the 10th century onwards. So after the destruction of the Fatimid palaces, they were rebuilt by successive dynasties, or the site was rebuilt by successive dynasties who built their major monuments, their religious foundations and also their tombs with their huge domes in this spot. So it was always the center of power for Cairo and, of course, the rest of the empire that went with Egypt.
There's evidence of the Fatimids with their Shiite ideology all over Old Cairo. The symbols of faith are all important. For instance, here at the Al-Aqmar Mosque.
The central motif to the arch in the mosque is highly significant and symbolic to me as a Sunni Muslim. It places the name Ali, the son-in-law of the Prophet of Islam, alongside with the name Muhammad, the name of the Prophet. Now, no Sunni would elevate Ali to the point of equality as far as the Prophet is concerned. So this is very much a Shia mosque a Fatimid mosque and therefore reflective of Shia philosophy, ideology and identity.
Further up the same road, near to the northern gates of the old city, stands another Fatimid mosque which has symbolized mixed religious signals for centuries. The Al-Hakim Mosque was built at the turn of the 11th century. For many, it serves as a reminder of the darker periods of Fatimid rule. Al-Hakim himself was said to be capricious and cruel. He had many of the city's dogs destroyed in a rage about their barking, and he was harsh in his subjugation of women. On his death, he disappeared while out riding at night. His esteem among his Shia followers only grew. Al-Hakim is a controversial figure. Sunnis remember him as the man who burnt Fustat, the largely Sunni town, and for having passed some very strange laws. For example, it is said he ordered people to wear winter clothes in summer and summer clothes in winter. But for some Shia, he is still venerated. This was a mosque established by a very powerful man, and it was fully intended to reflect that power, both religious and secular. It is difficult to reconcile the cool and peaceful building here now with the brutality and violence associated with Al-Hakim. There's still controversy here today, but of a different kind. Heavy restoration work has been recently undertaken. But it is deemed to be out of keeping with the style and traditions of the city and the building. Thankfully, the beautiful old minarets still stand. The Fatimids weren't just patrons of architecture. They supported other arts and in so doing embellished their palaces. Lusterware was one form of ceramics which flourished under the Fatimids. It was invented in 9th century Iraq. Political and economic disturbances made the craftsmen flee, spreading their decorating techniques throughout the Islamic world. Lusterware is recognizable by its distinctive metallic sheen. The decoration is painted onto a hard surface using a pigment containing metal oxides. After firing, the residue is polished off to get the lustrous sheen. There was a surprising range of subjects on the ceramics. They reflect a lifestyle which included enthusiastic feasting and drinking as readily as praying. And hunting scenes involving animals and humans are as common as plants and vegetal forms.
They weren't here for all that long.
What, two centuries?
Yes, about 2 centuries. And then
What the Fatimids started in Old Cairo, successive dynasties continued. There was no shortage of building work in the rich merchant city, and the interweaving of the sacred and the secular was everywhere. This was a sabil. It acted as a water dispenser and as a school. Cairo desperately needed water, and the only source was the Nile. So thousands of people were employed in filling underground cisterns. There was one underneath this building. The sabil was built by an Ottoman emir who is said to have felt the need for some piety amid an otherwise colorful lifestyle. The semicircular arches indicate the Ottoman style. The building is pretty run down these days, but still preserves touches of its fading beauty.
all the tile work inside this building, which is an 18th century building, so it's much later than some of the other things we've been looking at, All of it was made in Damascus and shipped here. It's not the best Iznik quality tilework, but it is rather beautiful nonetheless to have a room that's lined with this costly, rich material. And you can see the same sort of materiality in the grills that surround the three places where the water would have been given out from these basins, the three basins here. The roof, which is a painted roof, and also with elaborate woodwork. So it's a very, very rich space.
The Islamic spirit of ilm isn't just about art and architecture, it also embraces the sciences. Since Roman times, the water from the Nile had been channeled around the city of Cairo by aqueducts. These were fed by water wheels. The Nile lost its water wheels long ago, but they still exist elsewhere up in Syria. 17 of the gigantic wheels can be found in Hama, north of Damascus. The largest is 20 meters in diameter. Powered by the flow of the river, day and night they would tirelessly lift water from the river up to the aqueduct and so to the fields and city. The rivers weren't only a source of water, but also carried the silt that fertilized the fields. If you knew the flood levels, you could predict the amount of irrigation. Then you could also predict the area fertilized by silt, and that way you could predict the crop. The flood had been measured since the days of the pharaohs. Early on, the Umayyads installed what's called a nilometer here at the southern tip of Rhoda Island in the Nile at Cairo. It was destroyed by an exceptionally high flood in 850 and replaced by the sophisticated structure that is still here today. An Abbasid Caliph built this pit. It was fed with water from the Nile via 3 portals. In the center of the pit sat a marble octagonal column that was marked off in cubits. A cubit is just under 50 centimeters. From this, the height of the Nile flood could be read. Around the top of the pillar are Kufic scripts taken from the Quran, referring to water, vegetation, and prosperity. Too much flood, of course, was as much a disaster as too little. Even when it was just at the right level, there was some bad news. The nilometer's reading was used to set the country's taxes. The knowledge and learning in Islamic Egypt wasn't just confined to hydraulics and mathematics, though. Ilm had many facets, and one building in particular came to represent knowledge and understanding. In Old Cairo, the Khan al-Khalili is where today's visitor meets the hard bargaining and the bartering associated with all Arab bazaars. But even the 21st century trinkets reflect Egypt's long history. The Khan al-Khalili itself dates back to the early days of the walled and fortified city, and it sits halfway between 2 of the fine mosques built by the Fatimids. One of them was Al-Hakim, but its fame has been far surpassed by the other, the internationally renowned Al-Azhar Mosque.
The Al-Azhar Mosque has a very special place in Islamic history because it is probably the oldest functioning teaching institution in the Islamic world. This happened shortly after it was founded in the 10th century.
Al-Azhar was founded right at the start of the Fatimid era, only a year after the new rulers arrived in Cairo. It was the first mosque to be built inside Cairo's city walls. The main building has white marble columns holding up the porticos surrounding the great courtyard. And more than 300 ancient marble capitals supporting the roof of the prayer hall. 1,000 years ago, when Cairo was at its height, the importance of ilm or education in Islam was paramount. Al-Azhar keeps that spirit alive today. The teaching of the Prophet Muhammad had established the supremacy of scholarship and learning in Muslim society. There's still a basic tenet of Islam. For instance, there's a saying, the ink of the scholar is more sacred than the blood of the martyr. So it is vital that students are taught the high status learning has in classic Islam. Indeed, for me, there is a straightforward correlation between the great days of Islam as a religious and political force and the great days of Islamic learning, scholars, and scholarship. To maximize the vitality and the values of Islam, Muslim scholars and leaders need to return to that spirit of inquiry and tolerance that marked Islam's great days. While we reflect on the achievements of medieval Islam, and the Fatimids especially, we should remember that their power spread far beyond what is conventionally known as the Middle East. Muslim rule spread all around the Mediterranean too. Sicily was an Islamic stronghold and one where Fatimids had particular influence. When the Fatimids took Egypt, they captured a lot more of the Islamic world with it.
What they inherited included Sicily. And Sicily was a Muslim country to a large extent, with the whole heritage of North African Islamic architecture, and maintained that connection with the Fatimids once the Fatimids had taken Egypt.
Fatimid architects and workmen were busy long after Fatimid rule had ceased in Egypt, and long after another great power had entered Sicily from the north.
What we really have surviving is the architecture of the Normans. They took it from the Fatimids, they removed all elements of Islam in a religious sense, but they inherited the cultural elements of Islam.
When the Muslims in Sicily eventually became Norman subjects, the site of the mosque in Palermo became a cathedral. Sicily had become a bustling center of trade and industry under the Muslims. The new Norman king, Roger I, and his successors were quick to employ the remaining Muslim craftsmen and adapt the Muslim styles of building and decoration. New churches like San Cataldo, with its distinctive red domes, sprang up from the designs of Muslim architects. There were others on the same lines.
What you get left with is the echoes of the Fatimids translated into Norman terms, done by Muslim architects, done sometimes by architects and artists coming from Byzantium, and which echo the palaces in Cairo in the North Africa of the Muslims.
In the Cappella Palatina, another Roger II, commissioned his Muslim craftsmen to create a remarkable painted wooden ceiling over the nave of his Christian chapel. The Normans had finally conquered Sicily in 1072. In Egypt, the Fatimids survived for another 100 years. When the last Fatimid ruler died, his successor was an outstanding figure. Just as in Damascus and Jerusalem, he became a legend in Cairo.
The Fatimids were great patrons of art and architecture, but they were a Shia minority ruling over a largely Sunni population. And after 2 centuries, their rule was finished by the man who built this wall, the legendary Salahuddin himself. So Salahuddin, apart from recapturing Jerusalem from the Crusaders and fighting King Richard the Lionheart, also is known here for restoring Sunni power.
He was also responsible for building the Citadel of Cairo, now topped by much later Ottoman domes. Mighty though Saladin was, his dynasty was in many ways a link between the Fatimids and the other great line who have left their artistic mark so firmly on Cairo, the Mamluks, warrior slaves who had ousted their masters. As ever in Islam, the Mamluks were prodigious mosque builders.
There is one mosque which is so unusual and becomes so famous that it's found its way on the back of an Egyptian 100-pound note.
The Sultan Hassan Mosque is one of the jewels of Mamluk Cairo. Mamluk architects were faced with a difficult task. They had to create fine buildings in narrow, crowded streets, and their royal paymasters wanted the buildings to be visible from far away. But its founder was one of the more obscure Mamluk sultans. The mosque is tall for a religious building. 14th century Cairo was a crowded place, and building space was at a premium. The lofty facades with their austerely rectangular windows are said to have been the inspiration for the Chicago skyscrapers of the late 19th century. Education was strongly emphasized under the Mamluks, and this was an important complex with 4 schools or madrasas. If the exterior is impressive, the interior is truly striking.
A new ruler of Islam invariably built a central mosque to express his power and to show his faith. Sultan Hassan in the 14th century built this very impressive central mosque, the Sultan Hassan Mosque in Cairo. What is remarkable about this mosque is that in addition to a place for prayer, he had a free hospital for Christians and Muslims, and more remarkably, the 4 schools reflecting the 4 schools of theology within Islam, 2 over here and 2 in that direction, where young men and students could sit and talk about the differences which are minimum between the 4 schools. For example, in one school, young men may say their prayers in this way, in another, they leave their hands hanging. So not really great theological differences.
In its heyday, this would have held an enormous number of students who were accommodated in the 4 quadrants of the building. There are actually, in addition to this courtyard, there are 4 madrasa courtyards. There is accommodation for hundreds of students attached to each of these madrasas, so it would have been an extraordinarily busy place, with some of the overflows using these large iwans, these halls that are closed on 3 sides, open on the 4th, for extra teaching accommodation.
The way the 4 iwans at the Sultan Hassan Mosque are laid out to a cruciform plan was a distinctive Mamluk style. The 30-meter high iwans have relatively little interior decoration. After 5 years of building, and at the age of 26, Sultan Hassan was assassinated. Under his successors, the money ran out before the decoration could be completed. But what was completed is fascinating.
There's a very interesting feature that occurs in many Mamluk buildings, which is that the individual stones that hold up the arch are fitted together like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. But in one particular instance of this, we have the fitting together like this, not only on a vertical plane, but also on the horizontal plane, looking at it from below, a seeming impossibility. Perhaps they were able to do it in some ways diagonally, but it's a mystery that I haven't quite figured out myself yet even.
The main Iwan, which points towards Mecca, has the most elaborate decoration. The wood in this Iwan alone is said to have cost more than the cost of building an ordinary mosque. The Iwan served as prayer hall for the complex. In it, the mihrab displays a typical Mamluk use of marble. Thin slabs of the marble have been sliced off and laid on top of stone and brick. To the right of the mihrab is the mimbar, the Islamic equivalent of a Christian pulpit. Behind the heavily decorated double doors, the mimbar is the stairway to heaven from which the Imam preaches. Then, on the other side of the marble mimbar, can be found one of the artistic treasures of the mosque, a pair of doors leading to the mausoleum behind.
One of the doors to the mausoleum has wonderful inlay of silver and gold. Extremely fine work. On it you can see some Chinese lotuses, for instance. Now, this is a fairly unusual decorative motif before 1320 in Mamluk art and architecture. It's one that ultimately comes from China but was popularized in the Islamic world by the Ilkhanids, the Mongols who ruled over Iran at the same time. After 1320, the Mamluks and the Mongols made a peace treaty, and so from this point onwards we get portable goods such as textiles, perhaps ceramics, coming in from Iran with these motifs on them, and for the first time we see them appearing also in Mamluk art and architecture.
The mausoleum itself is richly decorated in many styles. Verses from the Quran rise above the doors in huge script. Finely detailed stalactite squinches support the heavenly dome, both structurally and figuratively. Sultan Hassan clearly wanted to be buried in style, but he was thwarted. Caught up in one of the many Mamluk squabbles, he was murdered and his body never found. Only his sons are buried here. From behind the fretwork surrounding their tomb, those sons are close to some fine inlaid ivory. The lectern has thousands of man-hours of craftsmanship in its detail. A lacework of intricately carved ivory sits within a starburst of hardwoods. The wood and ivory combination were often used for decoration in Mamluk times. Both inside and outside the mausoleum hang hundreds of mosque lamps. The lamps not only supply illumination, but also have a spiritual meaning. A verse from the Quran says that Allah's light is like a niche in which is a lamp. In the back streets of Cairo, there is still one workshop producing lamps in the old way. The early centuries of the Islamic period were the heyday of the glass blowers, although their art stretches back much further. A few years ago, archaeologists unearthed the remains of a glass factory from the 2nd millennium BC. Cairo, like many Muslim cities, hides many of its gems. In much of the Islamic world, I look for and often find beauty, even in poverty. In a district with the welcoming name of the Northern Cemetery is the Sultan Qaitbay Mosque, Madrasa and Mausoleum Complex, a major work from the end of the 15th century. It was also the last days of the military Mamluk regime. Its stonework marks the high point of Mamluk masonry carving. The trademark dome in the shape of a helmet harks back to the dynasty's origins as slave soldiers. Such stone domes are characteristic of Mamluk Egypt and not found elsewhere. Qaitbay was a highly efficient military and administrative ruler whose 29-year reign brought peace and stability to Mamluk Egypt. His mark is not only visible on the walls of his mausoleum, it can be found throughout the Middle East. As in this beautifully preserved fountain in the shadow of the dome in Jerusalem, or the Citadel in Alexandria. The fortress is built on the site of the Pharos Lighthouse, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. It is built of exceptionally large blocks of stone, some of which came from the lighthouse. It was another monument ordered by a ruler who stood out for his military prowess and his learning, a ruler who understood the importance of ilm. If Alexandria boasts a triumph of one of medieval Islam's great builders, it is also home to one of the most magnificent achievements of modern architecture in the Islamic world. The new Library of Alexandria, opened in 2002, is situated very close to the spot where the world's greatest ancient library once stood. As the carved wall, displaying characters from all the world's alphabets, suggests, it was a great center of learning, especially in mathematics and astronomy.
The ancient Library of Alexandria was really the beacon of learning for the world. There was an explosion of knowledge unmatched by anything in human existence. It is here, on this very spot where we stand. Aristarchus was the first human being to say the earth revolves around the sun.
That library was destroyed at the end of the 4th century. Its modern successor was designed by a young Norwegian architect, aided by Egyptian engineers. It cost £120 million to build. It includes 6 art galleries, 7 research institutes, a planetarium, and above all, a massive web library. One of these digital banks embraces the equivalent of 28 million books. The director sees this as all part of the search for knowledge, which is an integral part of Islam.
I believe as a Muslim that I have been enjoined by my faith and by the tradition of the Prophet to seek knowledge even to the edge of the world, to try to contemplate everything around me as we do in natural science and experimental science. And being a good Muslim is to learn and to pursue knowledge and to pursue truth.
The search for truth embraces old and new. Among the computer banks and high-tech aids, one of the library's most precious possessions is a collection of ancient documents and calligraphy containing many masterpieces of Islamic verse. Islam today faces stark choices. It has been plunged into globalization, and the young must live in the digital age. Too many young Muslims feel angry and dispossessed. If they are able to rediscover the importance of learning in their own tradition, they face a bright future. It is therefore in the interest of not only Muslim leaders, but non-Muslim ones too, to encourage Muslim youth to rediscover Islam's glorious past.
As a Muslim scholar, I believe that the great days of Islam were the great days of the scholars, the painters, the artists, the writers, the historians, and the scientists. The decline of Islam began when these people were marginalized and even persecuted. So here then, at the new library in Alexandria, we have a clear, bold, and important statement of the future.